Right. Recording. Okay, very good. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Theoretical and Computational Physics weekly seminar. Today, we are pleased to welcome Liesbeth Janssen from Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands. Liesbeth is originally a theoretical chemist who did her PhD at the Radboud University of Nijmegen in the Netherlands. This was followed by postdocs at New York University in the US and then Düsseldorf University in Germany before she joined Eindhoven University of Technology in 2017, first as an assistant professor and now as an associate professor. And today she's kindly agreed to tell us about her recent work on the glass transition. Before I hand over to Liesbeth for the truly interesting stuff, just a few words from me. Two announcements. First, this seminar is being recorded, so by staying on, you're giving consent to your voice and image being recorded and stored. The second announcement is in the interests of internet stability. Can I ask all of you, except the speaker, of course, to mute your microphone and switch off your camera during the seminar. If you wish to ask a question, you can, of course, unmute yourself, and if you so desire, switch on your camera. So without further ado, it's over to Liesbeth now.
Yeah, thanks very much. Let's see if I can go to full screen. All right. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this great seminar series. So what I'd like to do is share some recent work in our group in Eindhoven that deals with glassy physics. So my group in Eindhoven is generally interested in theory and simulation of non-equilibrium soft matter. And in particular, we're interested in three classes of soft materials. The first one is glassy materials, which I'll talk a lot more about in the remainder of this talk. The second class is active matter. So that's a relatively new class in condensed matter science that deals with particles that can somehow consume energy of whatever source into a form of autonomous motion, which renders these particles, these systems out of equilibrium at the single particle level. And finally, since 2 years or so, we're also looking at living materials, and in particular at the question how concepts of glassy physics and of active matter physics are manifested in biology. And in this talk, I'll touch upon the latter topic as well towards the end of my talk, but the main focus will be on the first class, so glass forming materials. So first of all, what do we mean by glass formation and the glass transition? So the glass transition is simply the transition from a liquid to a glass, and a glass is simply an amorphous solid, so a solid with a non-crystalline structure. And you can induce this transition in pretty much any material you can think of, and the most typical way to induce a glass transition is by rapidly cooling a liquid such that the material simply doesn't have time to crystallize. Now, experimentally, the process of glass formation has been known since ancient times. People have known how to make glasses for thousands of years. And by now, we also know that pretty much any material in the universe can undergo a glass transition. And if you think about our everyday lives, the most common example of a glass is, of course, the silica glasses, but also actually many plastics that we use are glasses made out of polymers, so amorphous polymer systems. And also, for example, colloids and metals are common examples of materials that can undergo glass transition. And even the living cells in our bodies can undergo the process of glass formation. So clearly, experimentally, it's a very ubiquitous phenomenon, and there's no mystery about this. But theoretically, there's actually quite a bit that we don't fully understand yet. And there are actually many interesting and puzzling aspects of glass formation from a theoretical point of view. But one of the most striking features of glass formation is that as you go from a liquid to a glass upon supercooling, you will find that the viscosity of the material increases very dramatically by many orders of magnitude upon only a small decrease in temperature. So here you see an example, actually fairly old data for many different glass forming materials. So on the y-axis here is the viscosity on a logarithmic scale. So this is many orders of magnitude. And on the x-axis, the inverse temperature. And you see that for all these different materials, the viscosity shoots up by many, many orders of magnitude over only a relatively small change in temperature. So that's really a dramatic slowdown of the dynamics as you go from liquid to solid. However, if you then look at what happens with the structure of the material during glass formation, you will find that there is surprisingly almost no change happening in the structure of the material. And that makes it a very unusual phase transition in physics. So if you look at the structure of a disordered system, like a liquid or a glass, there are different ways to quantify that structure. But one of the most simple ways to quantify structures is to look at something called the radial distribution function, G of R. So this function simply tells you, given that there's one particle here, what's the likelihood to find another particle some distance r away from that particle on average. So this is a two-particle correlation function that in a disordered system typically looks something like this. If you take the Fourier transform of this function, you get essentially what is called the static structure factor, S of k, where k is a wave vector. And this is a function that people usually measure experimentally in scattering experiments. But it contains essentially the same information as a radial distribution function. So it's a two-particle correlation function. And now on the right, you see what such a static structure factor looks like for a real glass forming material as you go from liquid to glass. So the bottom curve is a liquid and the top one is the glass. And these structure factors are all plotted with a little offset so that you can see the difference. But actually, if you look closely, you will see that there is hardly any change happening in the structure. There are very small, subtle changes in the structure, but nothing a priori that would tell you that the viscosity is changing over 15 orders of magnitude here as you go from the bottom curve to the top curve. And so that means there's essentially a disconnect, an apparent disconnect between structure and dynamics. And that really lies at the heart of the glass transition problem, that the structure on the one hand remains almost the same to that of a normal liquid, yet the dynamics slows down by more than 15 orders of magnitude. Now, zooming in on the dynamics a bit more, I already mentioned the viscosity, which is, of course, a macroscopic material property, but you can also look at simply the motion of individual particles. And then the most obvious difference between a liquid and a glassy system is that in a liquid, particles can move around relatively easily, while in a glass, the particles tend to stay very close to some equilibrium position, and in the solid phase, they will only vibrate a bit around that equilibrium position. And now, so this more microscopic picture of the dynamics can also be quantified in different ways. And one of those ways is to look at something called a two-point density correlation function, FKT. This is also called the intermediate scattering function, and it's also something people can measure experimentally. So what this function measures is essentially the time-dependent version of the static structure factor. So it probes correlations in particle positions, both in space and in time. And in particular, in the Fourier domain, this function can be defined as a correlation function between two density modes, one at time 0 and one at time t, for any given wave vector k. And k then basically sets the inverse length scale over which you want to probe the microscopic dynamics for that particular length scale. So simply put, this dynamic correlation function tells you essentially how rapidly particles lose track of their initial positions. And to give you an idea what these functions look like, for normal liquids, particles can move around very easily, so they quickly forget where they were some time ago. And that translates to a very rapid decay of this density correlation function, a decay to 0. And the typical relaxation time, so the decay time at which this function decorrelates to 0, is also actually a measure for the viscosity. So this is for a normal liquid, but for a glass forming material, the picture is much more complex. And in particular, we often see a plateau developing here at intermediate timescales, which can actually extend over many, many decades in time, so many orders of magnitude. And this plateau here is then actually an indication of solid-like behavior, because if this function remains finite, it means that the particles retain strong correlation with their position a long time ago. So that's indicative of solid-like behavior. Now, if you wait long enough and you're still on the liquid side of the transition, this function will decay to 0 eventually. But if you're in the glass phase, then this function will remain finite for as long as you can do the experiment. And that is, in fact, also an order parameter for the glass transition. So whether the long time limit of this object becomes 0 or remains finite. All right, so now one of the major open questions in the field is how we can then relate these tiny, tiny structural changes in the material as we go from liquid to glass to this emergence of very slow dynamics where the dynamics slows down by many, many orders of magnitude to ultimately produce a solid. And this apparent disconnect between structure and dynamics and the glass transition in general has actually even been called one of the deepest unsolved problems in condensed matter physics. Now, I am certainly not the first person to think about this problem. There's a famous quote by Dave Waits, who's an experimentalist, who said in an interview, there are more theories of the glass transition than there are theorists who propose them. And that was in 2008. And by now there are even more theories of the glass transition. But none of those theories that have been proposed so far are universally accepted, and there's still no full consensus on what is the best way to think about and understand the physics of glass formation. And also many of these theories are in one way or another somehow phenomenological in nature, and they all take different starting points and different phenomenological ingredients to build their theory from. But of course, complementary to any phenomenological approach, it would also be nice to have a really first principles description of this problem, in particular, starting from the basic laws of physics that everyone agrees on and try to take it from there to build a full theory to predict the emergence of glassy dynamics. And so that's something I'm interested in. So to build a first principles theory of the glass transition to really predict the emergence of glassy dynamics from only structural information alone. All right, now actually there is already a first principles theory of the glass transition. It's called Mode-Coupling Theory, developed by Wolfgang Goetze and co-workers in the early 80s. And this theory still stands out as the unique first principles based framework for the glass transition, where it tries to link the small structural changes as encoded in the static structure factor to the emergence of glassy dynamics as encoded in this intermediate scattering function. Now, I'll briefly walk you through the theory because it will become important later on. So briefly, the starting point of mode-coupling theory is the exact equation of motion for the intermediate scattering function for a glass forming material. So it really starts from the exact microscopic picture of a correlated liquid. And that exact equation turns out to be this integral differential equation here for FKT. So if we could solve this equation for all times t, for all wave vectors k that we're interested in, and all temperatures and densities of a material, then we would be able to predict the full microscopic dynamics of that system, and then in a way we could argue that we have solved that problem where we can really predict the full dynamics of a glass forming material. Now, to give you an idea what this equation looks like, you can compare it with the form of a damped harmonic oscillator, which is really quite similar. There's a second derivative here, and there's a linear term here and here. And then finally, there's a first derivative here and here. So it's quite similar. But for damped harmonic oscillator, the damping coefficient is a constant. While in our equation here, we have this function m that is now a time-dependent object. So this function m, you can think of it essentially as playing the role of a time-dependent damping in this equation. And you can also see that this function m has to be integrated over all previous times from time 0 up to the current time t. So this function is also called the memory function because it contains information about the past, the history of the system. Now, the key question is, what is this memory function exactly? If we would know that, we would be able to solve this equation rigorously. Now, it turns out to leading order, this memory function can be written as a more complicated object that now contains a correlation function over 4 different density modes. So it probes correlations between 1, 2, 3, 4 different density modes at 4 different wave vectors and between time 0 and any time t. Now, the problem is that we don't know what this 4-point density correlation function is because we don't even know what the 2-point density correlation function is for which we wanted to solve this equation in the first place. So what to do? Then mode coupling theory does essentially the simplest non-trivial thing you can do, which is to factorize these 4-point density correlation functions into a product of 2 2-point correlation functions. Now, there's not necessarily physically any good reason to do this, so it's actually an uncontrolled approximation. But if you do this, and then you may recognize that actually these new 2-point correlation functions that you've produced here are in fact the very definition of our intermediate scattering function for which we wanted to solve this equation in the first place, but just at different wave vectors q. So here one at q and at k minus q. And so this is mode coupling theory in a nutshell. And so what we end up with is actually a self-consistent equation for fkt. We write down this equation for fkt, and then via the memory function, we find that there are an fqt and an fk minus qt here in the memory function. And in fact, we also integrate over all possible wave vectors q here in the memory. And so that's actually how you couple all the density modes for all possible wave vectors in the system through this memory function. And that's also where the name mode coupling comes from. So I hope that is clear, at least. And importantly, the only input that the theory needs then to then solve this equation and predict the dynamics is only the static structure factor, which is essentially your boundary condition at time equals 0. So the static structure factor appears here and also implicitly in these vertices here. So once you know the static structure factor for all relevant wave vectors of your favorite system at any given temperature and density, you can plug that into this theory and then solve this equation self-consistently to get a prediction for the dynamics. All right, that is mode coupling theory in a nutshell. And so by now, the theory has been around for quite some decades. And by now we know there are some things that theory can do really well and some things it cannot do so well. So one of the main successes is that it gives a qualitative account of glass formation from taking only the static structure factor as input and looking at these tiny, tiny changes in the static structure factor. Somehow the theory is able to predict indeed the emergence of glassy behavior in a glass transition from only those tiny structural changes. So that's really a remarkable success of the theory. And as a bonus, it also gives an intuitive interpretation of that phenomenon in the so-called cage effect. So that follows essentially from the theory. If you look closely at the equations, And so the cage effect is essentially saying that you get a slowdown of the dynamics because particles become trapped in local cages formed by the neighboring particles, which induces a strongly nonlinear feedback mechanism that slows down the dynamics enormously. And also another remarkable success of the theory is that it predicts certain universal scaling laws in the dynamics. In particular, for the experts in the audience, there are certain scaling laws in the so-called early beta regime and the late beta regime and the alpha relaxation regime. And mode coupling theory predicts that basically mathematically from the equations, and those scaling laws are found to be in very good agreement with both experimental and simulation data. However, the theory is obviously not exact. So there are also some things the theory cannot do so well. And just to mention a few, generally the theory always gets the temperature for the glass transition wrong. In fact, it always tends to overestimate the glassiness of a material. And that also means that the theory is never really quantitatively accurate at any temperature, really. So if you want to get a good agreement between a mode coupling prediction and a real experimental simulation result, you typically have to do some ad hoc rescaling of the parameters, which is, of course, not something you really want to do with a first principles theory. So to summarize, there's still room for improvement. And now in the last few decades, many people have thought about how to improve mode coupling theory in a really first principles manner. And there's one particular interesting approach put forward by Grzegorz Zamol in 2003 that I think is now the most really most promising approach to improve mode coupling theory, and that's called generalized mode coupling theory. So the idea of generalized mode coupling theory is the following. Remember, we want to predict the microscopic dynamics of these 2-point density correlation functions, which through this memory function was governed by a more complicated 4-point density correlation function. And then in mode coupling theory, we say we don't know what this is, so let's factorize it as a product of two 2-point correlation functions. Now, what Grzegorz Zamol said was, even if we don't know what these 4-point correlation functions are, we can develop a new formally exact equation of motion for these 4-point correlation functions. And that turns out to be, again, very similar to this damped harmonic oscillator-like equation for the 4-point density correlation functions, but with a new memory function that is now governed to leading order by 6-point correlation functions. And of course, we also don't know what these 6-point correlation functions are, but then we can make our closure approximation there by, for example, saying that our 6-point correlations are a product of a 4 and a 2-point or 3 2-point correlation functions. And so we refer to that as second order generalized mode coupling theory. And now you can imagine that in principle, you can extend this scheme up to infinite order. You can, again, keep the 6-point correlation functions as they are, develop a new exact equation of motion for those 6 points. You will then get a new memory function that is governed by 8-point correlations, which in turn are governed by 10-point correlation functions, etc. So you build a hierarchy of coupled equations, and then you can make this uncontrolled factorization approximation only at infinite order, and then you have effectively washed away that whole approximation altogether. So this should be in principle a systematic way to really improve the theory by incorporating more and more levels in this hierarchy of equations. All right, so that was the idea. And then another 12 years later, my then postdoc advisor, David Reichman, and I took this idea and really tried to build the full generalized mode coupling theory with full wave vector dependence and full time dependence, and see if indeed that framework allows us to give a quantitative prediction of the dynamics of a glass forming material using only structural information as input. So before I show you some results, let me briefly show you what these equations look like. So for each level n in this hierarchy, we have this integral differential equation, but this memory function here at each level n becomes more complicated, unfortunately. So at each level n, we have n different integrals where we integrate over the n+1 point correlation function. And then all of those functions have then also n+1 different wave vectors that we have to consider. So this actually becomes a combinatorial problem that gets out of hand computationally at some point. But this is the idea. I should also mention briefly, the theory is still not exact. We've still made some remaining approximations. But what I want to emphasize is that it is still first principles based in the sense that we try to predict the full dynamics of the system from only structural information. And we introduce no free parameters, no phenomenological approximations whatsoever. All right, and now before I show you some results, I have to mention one more thing, which is how we close these hierarchical equations. So one way to do it is in the same spirit as mode coupling theory by factorizing the highest point correlation functions as a product of lower order ones. And we also refer to that as a mean field closure. Alternatively, we've also considered the case where we just rigorously truncate this hierarchy by setting the highest point correlations to 0. There's also not necessarily physically any good reason to do that, but that's an alternative approximation you can use. In that case, it means that in this example, if we set the 6-point correlations to 0, that the 4-point correlation functions here then decay without memory because we set the memory to 0. So these will just show simple exponential decay. And that will then be the memory input for the 2-point correlation function here. And so we refer to this as an exponential closure. And it turns out, and that's entirely non-trivial mathematically, but that these two families of closures actually give us an upper and a lower bound for the predicted dynamics. And as we apply these closure approximations at higher and higher order, they will systematically get closer and closer to each other and gradually approach the infinite order solution. But that's both mathematically and physically, I think, non-trivial that this convergent behavior is in this framework. All right, now with that, I'd like to show you some results. These are actually fairly old results from 2015, but I think they still show nicely what the theory can and cannot do. So here I'm showing you some results for the microscopic dynamics of a glass forming system of hard spheres simulated by these authors here. So they provided us with the static structure factors at different densities, and they also provided us with the real intermediate scattering functions coming out of the simulations. And that's what you see in black here. So these are the real exact dynamics from simulation. And I'm showing you plots for two different wave vectors here, left and right. The blue curves here are the mean field closures, and red is an exponential closure. Now these two plots here are still for fairly low volume fractions where the system still behaves as a liquid. And so this blue dashed line here is a standard mode coupling result. And you can see that it's not far off from the real result from the simulation. But if we go to a higher order in generalized mode coupling theory, we get slightly closer to the exact result. And the highest order I could calculate at the time, so making a closure approximation at the level of 8-point correlation functions, gets us almost exactly to the result that it should be. So that's encouraging. Then going to slightly higher volume fractions of 50%, this is where we start to see the onset of glassy dynamics. And here you can see that mode coupling theory in its standard form already tends to overestimate the dynamics quite a bit, as in it predicts too slow dynamics. But going to higher order generalized mode coupling theory, we again see that we systematically approach the result of the simulation. And finally, the highest volume fraction I could calculate at the time at 57%. This is where standard mode coupling theory breaks down completely because it predicts a glass here, while in reality, the system is still on the liquid side of the transition. And going one order higher in generalized mode coupling theory actually brings us much, much closer to the result that it should be. and the highest order gets even closer. So there are two things I want to point out from these results. First of all, note the uniform convergence pattern. Each higher level in the GMCT hierarchy brings us closer to the simulation data. And so that's encouraging because it suggests that we don't necessarily have to go to infinite order to already get a good estimate of the infinite order solution. And secondly, remember that we still made some approximations in the theory. And so the theory is still not exact. And you can already see here for this wave vector that our theoretical predictions develop some sort of shoulder here in the data that is not present in the exact simulation data. So this is an indication that our remaining approximations start to break down here as well. And in particular, one interesting implication of this is, I forgot to mention this explicitly, but one of the main approximations we've made here is that all the relevant structural information of the system is fully contained in the static structure factor only. And that's a two-particle correlation function. But it's plausible that as you get closer to the glass transition, you also have to start worrying about 3-particle or 4-particle or n-particle structural static correlations that also contain important information about the structure. And so it's plausible that as we get closer to the glass transition, the theory also needs to know about those higher order structural correlations to get a really accurate prediction of the dynamics. And so that's something we're also working on right now, to incorporate those higher order structural correlations as additional input to the theory to then predict the full dynamics. So by now my group, this is work by my PhD student Chen-Jie Liu, has really pushed this idea to another 2 levels higher in the hierarchy by just improving the numerical algorithms. So these are results for hard spheres where you see the relaxation time here as a function of the packing fraction. And interestingly, what we find is that all these mean field closures always give us a power law divergence of the relaxation time, while these alternative closures that we call the exponential closures actually never give us a sharp glass transition, and also doesn't really show power law growth, but rather more exponential or activated dynamics. And so this is up to 6th order, and it would be interesting to see where these 2 families of closures would meet if we would be able to push this to infinite order. And secondly, I also briefly mentioned that standard mode coupling theory predicts these universal scaling laws for the dynamics. And so Chen-Jie also analytically derived that all these scaling laws are fully preserved in generalized mode coupling theory at arbitrary order. So that's great, but the exponents in these scaling laws, so there's certain power law behaviors here, those exponents can change quantitatively and even improve as you go to higher order in this framework. So that's, I think, very encouraging that this framework is able to preserve some of the main successes of the standard mode coupling theory, but then on top of that can add a quantitative improvement as well. And just to close this section, I'll also mention that we'll briefly mention that with this framework, we're now also looking at more complex glass forming materials, not just hard spheres, but also functional materials like vitrimers, which is a new kind of polymer glass with very interesting properties, and mixtures and metallic alloys and so on. We're also, of course, trying to brute force the theory to really eliminate all the remaining approximations in the theory to really get to work towards an exact first principles theory for the dynamics. And so in particular, we're both trying to improve the dynamic equations, and we're trying to add additional structural information as input beyond the level of the 2-particle static structure factors. And we're also doing this in collaboration with some other groups. And finally, we're also now starting to think about how machine learning can help with this problem. Machine learning is, of course, a little bit of a buzzword these days. But if you think about the glass transition problem, machine learning is actually almost perfect for this problem, because the whole open question is how tiny structural changes in this disordered system translate to the emergence of glassy dynamics. And so this is something that agnostic machine learning algorithms might be able to pick up on really well to identify hidden correlations in a disordered structure and use that information to hopefully help us develop a better theory of the glass transition as well. So if you're, I'll just briefly mention, we also have a postdoc position available in that direction as well. So if that's something you're interested in, do feel free to reach out to me. Now, in the last few minutes, I'd like to now think about what happens in active and living materials, because actually there's growing evidence that all the physics of glass formation that we've known for many decades in ordinary materials is also manifested in active and living systems. So in particular, if you look at how cells are structured in a cell layer, that's also often in a disordered manner, quite similar to how the atoms or molecules are structured in a liquid or in a glass. And if you look at the dynamics of such cells, they can also sometimes move quite easily, like atoms in a liquid, and sometimes they don't move very much at all, like the particles in a glass. And so in this example here, you see that as in this case, the density of cells increases, the dynamics also slows down by, in fact, several orders of magnitude. So this is actually a biological realization of a kind of glass transition in living cells. And by now there's a whole body of literature emerging where people start to recognize features of glassy dynamics in living cells. These are just a few highlighted papers. If you want to know more, I'll also refer you to this review paper here. But interestingly, this emergence of glassy dynamics in living systems is not just, let's say, scientific fun fact, but actually there's also growing evidence that the degree of glassiness in these cells, so how slow the cell dynamics is, also has biological and even medical implications. And in particular, this degree of glassiness can say something about the pathological state of cell tissues. And so this is now realized in both health and in disease, that the degree to which these cells can move, so how liquid-like or how glassy they are, that has direct consequences, and that the ability for cells to switch between more liquid-like and more glass-like behavior can also really change the biological functionality of cells. So this is, I think, really an exciting field where glassy physics has something interesting to add. So what my group is interested in is looking at these biological phenomena through the lens of physics, and asking if, let's say, we have this cell layer here, this schematic picture of cells. If we then look at, say, the positions of the nuclei in this cell layer, even if we don't know what exactly these cells, how they interact, they of course have very complicated many-body interactions. They have all sorts of complicated biological signaling pathways. But if we just look at the average, the statistical average structure of these cells, can we then quantify that structure in pretty much the same way as we do in ordinary glass forming materials, by quantifying the structure in terms of, for example, static structure factor, and quantifying the dynamics in terms of these intermediate scattering functions. And then, of course, then use our tools from statistical physics to see if we can relate structural changes in these cell layers to changes in the dynamics. And so for that, we started out with computer simulations of a cell model. This is work by our master student, Marijke Valk. So here you see two short simulation movies of a model called the self-propelled Voronoi model, developed by the group of Lisa Manning and co-workers, where we see on the left that the cells are able to move a bit more easily than on the right. So the left is more liquid-like and the right is more solid-like behavior. And the only difference in these two videos is basically, what is called the preferred cell perimeter. So basically how elongated these cells like to be. On the left, they like to be a bit more elongated, and on the right, they like to be a bit more circular. And so that's enough to tune the dynamics from more liquid-like to more solid-like behavior. And then Marijke extracted static structure factors from all these simulations and the intermediate scattering functions to quantify the dynamics, and then apply a mode coupling analysis to these results. And so here you see the results. So what you see on the left are the simulation results, where we plot the relaxation time as a function of this preferred cell perimeter. In the interest of time, I won't say too much about it. I'll only point out that we see this non-monotonic behavior here in the simulation for the dynamics. And then applying mode coupling theory to these data, we get the right predictions here for the dynamics from mode coupling theory. And although the theory is not quantitatively accurate, it actually captures this non-monotonic behavior qualitatively pretty well. And that's remarkable for several reasons. First of all, the mode coupling theory has, of course, not been developed for cells originally. It was developed for ordinary simple glass forming materials. And yet it's able to capture this fairly non-trivial feature in the dynamics from only subtle structural changes in these cell layers. And secondly, we actually did a pretty crude job here by taking only the standard mode coupling theory that doesn't yet know that these cells are active. So we just assumed ordinary dead Brownian dynamics here, while in reality in the model, the cells are active as well. So even with that crude approximation to ignore activity in the theory, we also already captured this qualitative feature quite nicely. And then finally, what about experiments? So for that, Marijke spent a few months in the groups of Jim Butler and Jeff Fredberg at Harvard Medical School, who have these beautiful experimental cell data. So Marijke extracted the static structure factors and the intermediate scattering functions from these data by looking at the positions of the cell nuclei over time. So these are the static structure factors and the intermediate scattering functions from experiment. And then we also applied mode coupling theory again to see if from only the static structure factor, we can predict the slowdown in dynamics. And so here you see the results. These are the results from the experimental data, where the relaxation time grows as the cell layer matures. So it slows down monotonically in this case. And the mode coupling prediction also predicts the same monotonic increase in the relaxation time. Again, the quantitative numbers are off, but that's also something we would expect from mode coupling theory, that it's never really quantitatively accurate anyway. But qualitatively, it does a pretty good job also in these experimental data. So that's, I think, already a very encouraging result that the crudest version of this theory, again, developed in the early 80s for normal glass forming liquids that are not active and not alive, that this theory can do a pretty good job to already qualitatively predict the behavior seen both in these active cell simulation models where we saw this non-monotonic behavior, and in the real experiments where we see a monotonic increase in relaxation time. And now ongoing work is obviously to work towards a more realistic theory for these kinds of systems. In particular, we need to include activity in the theory because cells are obviously active. So we're working on that with another PhD student, Vincent Davids. And in another line of research, we're also looking at a phenomenon called aging that's in active systems. So aging, I would say, is a separate field within the world of glassy physics, where the dynamics gradually changes over time. So the material properties also evolve as the material gets older. And that's a generic property of glasses that we're now also starting to explore in active glassy systems. And that is work by another PhD student, Julia Janssen. And with that, I'd like to wrap up and conclude. So this framework that we call Generalized Mode-Coupling Theory, first put forward by Gregor Jamel in 2003, is now starting to emerge as a purely first principles based framework that has the potential to ultimately become quantitatively accurate, to link the very subtle changes in the structure of a glass-forming material to the emergence of glassy dynamics and this spectacular slowdown over many orders of magnitude. So it's systematically correctable. There are no free parameters. And yeah, the idea is that if you are going to sort of brute force include more and more of these correlations in the framework, you should get a better answer. And so we're now pushing that idea both theoretically by improving the algorithms and hopefully also employing ideas from machine learning to brute force improve the theory in a more intelligent manner. And finally, we're also starting to realize that this theory, although it was originally developed only for simple glass forming liquids, it's also applicable to more complex systems, including living cells. And one particular exciting outlook, which is certainly speculative, but that I think is very interesting to think about in general. If you remember that the degree of glassiness in cells can have consequences for your health, then imagine if a medical doctor would give you a snapshot of your cells. Would you be able, with a proper theory, to predict, just looking at the structure of these cells, how mobile and how the dynamics would be in the sample, and then be able to link that to the pathological state of these cell layers? So in a sort of longer term perspective, I think this is a direction where statistical physics in general could contribute to on making predictions and new insights in how the behavior of cells in both health and in disease can be understood from a theoretical and physical perspective. And with that, I'd briefly like to acknowledge a few people. So my postdoc advisor, David Reitman at Columbia University, introduced me to the field of the glass transition. Gregor Jamel, the founding father of generalized mode-coupling theory, has also been involved in a lot of interesting discussions. I'd also like to thank Jim Butler and Jeff Fredberg, who kindly offered their experimental cell data and also generously hosted Marijke Valk for a research stay in the group to analyze the experimental data. And of course, I'd like to thank my group in Eindhoven. All the students are shown here. And I'd like to thank you for your attention, of course, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Liesbeth, for an exciting seminar on the glass transition. So before I invite questions from the audience, let me just make a correction to a mistake I made at the beginning. Liesbeth was a postdoc at Columbia University, not New York University. At least I got the city right.
Indeed, it's not very far.
Okay, very good. Now, questions. We already see a few raised hands now. Federico, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Liesbeth. Thank you very much for your very nice presentation. I'm a biologist, very bad in mathematics, actually, and physics in general. Didn't do a good job in those subjects during my career. But we are actually interested in some phenomenon that it's very important also for human health, related to, especially to neurodegeneration, but other disorders, no? Which is the formation of fibers from proteins that are originally soluble, are originally in liquid phase, and then they form crystals or fibers in cells, within cells, no, during the process of the neurodegeneration of the cell, during the aging of the cell. I was wondering if you are trying to apply these models to this new framework that people are considering, that these proteins first, they do like what they call liquid-liquid transition, which is an increase in viscosity within the cell, making like microdomains, areas where the concentration and the viscosity of the protein increases, and then these viscous spaces turn into fibers because of an increase in the interaction between the proteins. I'm talking always in biological terms, but I don't know if you are familiar with these subjects and the possibility to apply these models to this biological phenomena within cells.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with the work. And it's a super interesting field. I'm not sure mode coupling theory or these kinds of approaches would be the most suitable there. I think it's so mode coupling theory. If I understand correctly, the key in this problem you mentioned is something like a phase separation phenomenon. Right, where you locally densify a region, and in other regions it becomes more dilute.
Well, it becomes there's a differential between both regions, but then the region that is more concentrated, or the proteins tend to move less or diffuse less outside this region, and then these proteins turn into crystals, into actual solid bodies. You see what I mean? So it looks to me a lot like a glassy behavior, because the proteins are free or relatively dynamic and can exchange with relative freedom with the environment, but then at some point they turn into solid crystals that don't move anymore. You see? I could even show you a video. It's very impressive. It's a matter of minutes, but I mean, this is, sorry, hello? Yeah, I lost you. Sorry, I lost you.
Yeah, we can hear you, Federico.
Okay. So this is what, yes?
Yeah, hello, are you there?
Okay, I lost it.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay, in any way, this is my question. If you try to apply it.
The short answer to that question is no, we did not. And I also, well, one thing, issue I'm thinking about the theory that how we develop it is assuming a thermodynamic limit. So we basically assume a sort of infinitely large system, and there's no distinction between locally more dense regions and locally more dilute regions. And I think the problem you're describing is you have a, let's say, fixed concentration of proteins, but they aggregate together, right?
Yes.
So that's a strongly inhomogeneous case where maybe a framework like motility-induced phase separation could be more relevant, or something where you really have phase separation. And I think that's a crucial ingredient that the theory itself that we have does not account for. That just accounts for having a bulk material, you decrease the temperature or make the bulk density a bit higher, and that induces solidification. So I think that's a different problem, but it's a very interesting phenomenon nonetheless. Yeah. So yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, next question from Nuno.
Hi, Liesbeth. Thank you very much for your talk, and especially for the introduction. It was very clear at the beginning. So I have two questions indeed. So the first one is the first question is related to the interactions, right? So as far as I understand, you assume that you can infer about the interactions from the structure factor, right?
I wouldn't say that. No, actually, that's a major difficulty in any liquid state theory. If you just look at the structure, of a system, can you infer underlying
Exactly.
interactions from that? No, that's not, well, generally not an easy thing to do. So what we do actually is in simulations, you plug in some interaction potential, with or without activity. You then simulate and just see whatever structure comes out, and you take some statistical average measure for the structure, like a static structure factor. But that doesn't necessarily tell you anything for the reverse relation, how the structure relates to the interaction.
Yeah, but so in mode coupling theory, how do you account for the interactions?
Mode coupling theory itself does not know about the interactions per se. It only knows about the average structure that comes out.
Yeah.
By whatever interaction potential you have.
But that's the point. So the idea is that the interactions are somehow encoded in the structure factor.
Yes. So
but that is something.
Different interactions will yield a different structure factor.
Exactly.
So that's the only way the theory knows whether you're talking about hard spheres or silica or cells or whatever. That's only because the static structure factor is different. And so that comes ultimately from different particle interactions. But mode coupling theory only looks at the static structure factor only. Yeah. So that's a different level.
My point is, in an equilibrium system, I can establish a relation if I have a large system, an infinite system, between the structure and the interactions. But in the later part of your talk, you were talking about applying these ideas to non-equilibrium systems, and in particular, for example, in the case of the tissues, the confluent tissues, where my point is, wouldn't it be a very strong assumption that say that the structure that you get now, or at a certain point, is enough to infer about the interactions?
Well, I have to correct you there. We don't try to infer any information about the interactions.
Yeah, but you have it implicitly in the theory when you say that the only thing you need is the structure factor, right?
Yes, and the only reason we need the structure factor is that it's mathematically our boundary condition at t equals 0. Because we have an integral differential equation, so we need some boundary conditions. And so that's why we need the static structure factor and possibly higher order corrections to that as well.
Exactly.
So it doesn't matter what system you're talking about. If you want to apply this theory to whatever system with whatever complicated interactions, you need the static structure factor for that system, because that's your t equals 0 function you need to then solve for the dynamics. But we do not try to use that information to reversely engineer the interactions.
No, it's okay, but the dynamics depends on the interactions. So what you're saying is that from the structure, you can predict the dynamics, and that's where...
Yeah, I mean, there are different ways to predict the dynamic. One way is to do a simulation where you plug in single pair interactions and whatever you have, and just solve Newton's equations for each particle and undergoing all those particle interactions. And that's also a way to predict the dynamics. Here we're using a more coarse-grained picture. We use statistical average quantities like the static structure factor and like the intermediate scattering function, which are average over all particles. It's one correlation function for each wave vector that tells you something about the average dynamics in the system. And that's what we try to predict here. And at that more coarse-grained statistical level, you no longer need explicit information about the interactions. And all the interactions are implicitly in the static structure factor.
Exactly. Yeah. What is okay for an equilibrium system, but I don't know how strong assumption is.
Well, actually, to generalize this framework to active matter is non-trivial. Other people have already thought about this for standard mode coupling theory. There are different flavors of that and different approximations that go into the active theories. And so we're now also generalizing those things and trying to learn what we can say about structural dynamics relations in non-equilibrium systems. But I think this is still a sort of open field.
I also have a second question that is related with your exponential closure, okay? As far as I understand, what you are saying is that the two-point correlation function decays exponentially in time, right?
If you set the memory to 0, yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
So that's why you never get the glass phase, because as you get close to the critical point, okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's a simple argument. But then it's interesting to think if you go to infinite order, we see this convergent behavior, and how can that really be united with the other family of closures where we do see a sharp divergence at finite.
Like the second one you showed, the midfield.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. We now have a question from Margarida.
Okay, Liesbeth, thank you. It was a very nice talk. I have a few questions, but I also have a comment on your very last discussion with Nunu. Of course, you can go from exponential to some sort of infinite correlation length. It just means that at higher and higher orders, you'll get some sort of longer range correlations, and they will feed into your exponential decay. So that's how you could get from exponential, like you do in static, in equilibrium critical phenomena. But my question is really on that. So you were saying something which really bothered me a little bit. So I'd like some explanation if you can. You were saying that in these closures, you can go and you can reproduce the power laws, but the exponents change with the order of the closure. This is not how it happens in equilibrium. I can do that, but I mean, something like cluster theory or whatever it is, I get different, of course, the results are closer and closer to the simulations, and therefore, if I look, for example, at the phase diagram, my coexistence curve is getting closer and closer to simulations. But if I look close enough to the TC, the power law that I get from any order of any cluster sort of hierarchical theory is still mean field. So how do your exponents change? Do you have any explanation? Because you're still cutting off the correlations at finite. So why do the exponents change? Why don't they remain the same as for the zeroth order?
Yes, let me share my screen again. Let's see. Yeah, so in this.
Exactly.
Oh, shit, no. Here, yes. So the exponents I'm referring to, if you take your microscopic dynamics, your intermediate scattering function somewhere close to the glass transition, and you measure the onset of this plateau, how that scales in time, and the decay away from the plateau, and the long-term decay here. So there are certain exponents A, B, and there's also a gamma that relates to the power law for the alpha relaxation time. So you can fit those from your simulation. What is A, B, and gamma? And that's just a number it's different for each material you're thinking about. And then you do a mode coupling calculation. You also get a curve like this. And then you also try to do the same fit with the same functions. And then you get a different A, B, and gamma.
Depending on the order of the closure, that's what you said.
Yes. And then the fitted numbers from the simulation, you compare those with the fits from the mode coupling calculations. And then those numbers get.
Okay. So what you're saying is that even for different materials, these exponents are not universal in any sense.
Exactly. Oh, yeah. You have to do a new fit for each material. Yeah. They're not universal in that sense, but there are non-trivial relations between A, B, and gamma. Okay. That's universal, that they are mutually related, which is non-trivial.
But so I suppose what you're saying is that these are effective power laws in a finite domain, because it's not an infinite, because they really are, and they're even I mean, they're different. They're not universal in the sense that I was thinking of, because if they were, I could not see how the order of the
No, you're right. Yeah. No, what I meant by universal is that this form of the power law and the relation between A, B, and gamma is
exponents. But if I look close enough to where the transition is, but here you cannot probably look close enough because this is a finite range of temperature. I think I understood. Thank you very much. Thanks for the talk. It was very clear.
okay. Thanks.
Right. Do we have any more questions? I don't see any more raised hands. So I think this is it. Let's wrap up. Okay, Liesbeth, thanks very much again for a very informative talk on the glass transition. Thanks to everybody else for coming, and we'll be back next week. The recording stops